14. So we feel many more lecture series coming, Sabine. Sabine's course on Klimt 2 years ago was such a success that we are delighted to welcome her back in 2017 to speak about International Art Nouveau. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be back, and I'm delighted to see familiar faces in the audience as well as new faces. So this is really, am I speaking at a right level for the people in the back? Yes, great. Too loud? No, louder, okay. So this is really an opportune moment for me to presenting a series of lectures on International Art Nouveau, because I'm literally in the middle of compiling a manuscript on the various contributions that women made to the German manifestation of International Nouveau. And it's not so much women as artists and designers that I'm interested in, but I'm interested in women as critics, as collectors, as gallery owners. So I'm very much interested in the socio-cultural field that enabled Jugendstil to flourish. So I'm really pleased to be here because my head is in the material, so to speak. So we're going to spend this week thinking about International Art Nouveau. Now, this is a huge topic, as you know, and we will only be able to scratch the surface of it. But I thought that one way of getting at the topic would be through a series of case studies. And so this evening, I am intending to give you a bit of a general introduction to what I think International Art Nouveau is. And then as of tomorrow, we will look at specific examples to see how some of the more general ideas that I'm presenting this evening were actually worked out and manifested themselves in very specific geographical settings. So we're going to look tomorrow at an early example of International Art Nouveau in Brussels. We're going to be looking at Horta. Then we're going to be moving on to Glasgow, and I hope you will indulge me because that, of course, is the cultural context that surrounds me. So we're going to be thinking about the famous Glasgow 4. Then we're going to move south from the very north to Barcelona, and we're going to be thinking about Gaudi. And then on Friday, during the last lecture, we will wrap it all up. I will sneak in a little bit of Jugendstil, which isn't on the syllabus, and then we're moving on to the 1900 World's Fair, which was really the blossoming of International Art Nouveau. So I hope that by the end of the week, you will have a sense of the incredible richness and diversity of International Art Nouveau across Europe. One other thing I wanted to mention before we get going is that I will focus largely on architecture and the built environment over the week. I had to make some choices on what I can zoom into, and I think the built environment is a really interesting place to start our thinking about International Art Nouveau. The way that I am presenting the material has very much been influenced by an important exhibition that I really personally credit with opening my eyes to the rich cultural resonances of International Art Nouveau. And that was an exhibition that took place in 2000 and 2001 at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And then it moved on to the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And this was an exhibition that really looked at the origins and the history of International Art Nouveau. And it was curated by my eminent colleague at UEA, Paul Greenhalgh, and the exhibition catalog I put on the syllabus is one of the suggested readings. And it's really this exhibition now 16 years ago that put International Art Nouveau on the radar of a whole new set of audiences and individuals. And I must admit that before I saw this exhibition, I was slightly wary of International Art Nouveau because, of course, I had been studying modernism and the famous utterance form follows function, which is, of course, not something that can be said of International Art Nouveau. And modernists are notoriously wary of Art Nouveau and continue, I would argue, to have a difficult relationship with Art Nouveau, because the true hardcore modernist really sees this as frivolous, commercial, effeminate, and indeed sometimes overly sexualized. And this, of course, led to a very difficult reception history of International Art Nouveau. And art and design historians well into the 1950s pretty much ignored it or used it as, what's the expression, a straw horse, the sort of a bad example of what not to do. And it's only being gradually reinstated into the stories of modern art, architecture, and design. And this particular exhibition that I'm showing you an installation shot of had very much to do with a renewed interest of my generation of design historians in International Art Nouveau. So when we hear the term International Art Nouveau, and again, you will grow tired of me calling it International Art Nouveau, and I call it International Art Nouveau with a capital I rather than a small I, because I feel that if you only call it Art Nouveau, it's reduced to a French phenomenon only. And by putting the capital I, International, before Art Nouveau, I'm hoping that through this very language that I use, we're actually thinking about it as an international, cross-European, and a little bit North American phenomenon. But when we hear this term, we immediately conjure images of architecture, design, fashion, and the graphic arts that embrace the dynamic forces of nature and organic form. So when we hear the word Art Nouveau or International Art Nouveau, we think of Henri van de Velde's wonderful whiplash rooms. And this term whiplash actually goes back to the critical reception of this particular embroidery by the German artist and designer Hermann Obrist, which is basically a silk embroidery on a wool ground of a alpine violet. And it is abstracted in such a way that the critics in 1895, when they saw it in an exhibition, called it Peitschenhieb or whiplash, because they felt it really called up this almost time lapse of movement of a whip being moved through the air. We also think, of course, of Émile Gallet and his wonderful mushroom lamps, or on the right-hand side, his clematis lamp. Now, Gallet, of course, is a really important Art Nouveau artist from Nancy, from the school of Nancy, and he really revolutionized glass, and he worked with acid-etched glass, and then you can see particularly well on the right-hand side this wonderful hammered wrought iron base. So he really opened up a whole new set of possibilities and experimentation in this medium of glass. We also might think, and especially those of you who took my Vienna class 2 years ago, of Josef Maria Olbricht's wonderful cabbage roof at the Secession Building in Vienna, this gold-gilded foliage and berries that epitomize the Secession style, so this Viennese manifestation of international Art Nouveau. Or we might think of Alphonse Mucha's very many sensuous poster designs, and here's just one of them, Times of the Day from 1899. And here, each of the women really encompasses a mood that is reflected in the kinds of floral motifs that Mucha used. And finally, we of course think of Hector Guimard's wonderful and still in use Paris metro stations that he custom designed for the 1900 World's Fair. So I would certainly say that we're quite comfortable with sort of knowing what international Art Nouveau might have looked like. But I would like to spend this week now with you to locate the style historically. So rather than worrying about this question whether or not Art Nouveau was a style or a movement which has occupied art historians for decades, I'm more interested in, first of all, uncovering some of the origins of international Art Nouveau as a modern style. What made this new? What made this modern is the questions I would like to ask. Secondly, I would like us to think about some of the aims and the goals of the practitioners, of the makers of Art Nouveau spaces and objects. And thirdly, I'm hoping to offer you some insight into the critical reception of international Art Nouveau. So how did historical actors, how did contemporaries of this style, be they patrons, be they critics, be they exhibition visitors, collectors, consumers, how did they engage with this style? What did they think about it? How did they support it or not? So you can see in the way that I'm thinking about international Art Nouveau, I'm sort of proposing it to be both a style, because it has very specific criteria of form. It looks a very specific way, but it's also a movement, because this style, this form, manifested itself across all of Europe. So there was an international dimension to it. And international Art Nouveau, I want to stress, emerged really during an incredibly dynamic but also deeply fraught historical moment or time period, namely the 1890s. This is, and again, those of you who took my Viennese class, this is the fin de siècle, this is the Jahrhundertwende, this is the Belle Époque, the turn of the century. And for some historical actors, for some individuals living during this time period, these were incredibly heady days. It was exciting, there was lots of change and new beginnings on the horizon. And for others, it was a deeply pessimistic period, a coming to the end of an era and of a way of life that really had navigated European society for centuries. So the 1890s are this really vexing moment where these two impulses are kind of pushing up against one another. No matter where one stood, though, on this spectrum, embracing the new century, new beginnings, overthrowing of the old, or crying for the good old times, no matter where you stood on this spectrum, it all did come crashing down, of course, with the caesura of the First World War in 1914. So just to build a bit of a context, and this is probably a context that you're well familiar with, but what made the 1890s such a fertile historical ground for the kind of stylistic innovation that was characterizing international Art Nouveau? And of course, the 19th century as a whole was a time period that was full of change. We had, of course, industrialization accompanied by urbanization, starting with the Industrial Revolution in Britain and going with that. So that was the sort of first instance of this urbanization, and then spreading across Europe, so to speak, and ending up really in Germany in the 1870s. Germany was late to industrialization, but its industrialization was very accelerated. And this industrial revolution and the move of large populations from the country to the city really unsettled the social fabric. And we have one artistic response to this, for example, in Jean-Baptiste Lepage's romanticizing of rural life. Here we have The Love Story in the Village from 1882. Now this is a regressive and a progressive painting, because on the one hand, it as I said, romanticizes rural life. It doesn't really speak about the harsh realities of being a farmer or a peasant in an industrial nation. So it romanticizes it, but it's progressive because it's so naturalistic. Each plant is recognizable. He really was part of this naturalism movement, which made him progressive. Another really important change, of course, in the 19th century was technological and scientific progress. So the whole speed of life, the conveniences of life changed radically. I'm showing you here a postcard of the Dynamo Hall at the Paris World's Fair, and then the Department for Telephone Equipment at the same fair. And of course, that completely shifted a world that people lived in. You could pick up a telephone and speak to someone in a completely different city. This was accompanied also, of course, by new modes of travel. So not only new modes of communication, new modes of travel. And I've put up this poster for the Hamburg America line because, especially in Germany, many of the Art Nouveau or the Jugendstil designers actually ended up working for these ocean liner companies and furbished interiors. So Richard Riemerschmidt, for example, and Hermann Obrist were responsible for putting together the kinds of luxurious interior spaces that I'm showing you an example of on the right-hand side. 19th century was also characterized by incredible medical discoveries. We have the microscope, which opens up, of course, a whole new view of disease, of bacteria, I'm showing you here just a slide of tuberculosis bacteria. We have, as a result, debates around hygiene and sanitation in these big new metropoli, these big new cities. So, for example, there was a big exposition of hygiene in Turin in Naples, in 1900. And what the microscope did for bacteria, I would argue Freud did for the human psyche. He sort of archaeologically excavated all of our childhood traumas and ruptures that then, of course, led to all kinds of neuroses. And I'm showing you here his famous couch, which is at the Freud Museum in London. This went hand in hand with the questioning of many traditional hierarchies and socioeconomic stratas or sort of setups. We have the rise of the bourgeoisie, of course, who made their money in these new industries, but we also have this huge opening up of the working classes. And so I'm showing you here to epitomize this idea, Karl Marx's famous publication, Das Kapital, published in 1867, and then next to that, children working in a glass factory at night time. We also have the women's question. The new woman is on the horizon and represents, of course, a huge threat to male hierarchies. Women are agitating to vote. Women are agitating to be allowed to have an education in universities. And I love this advertisement on the left, the smoking woman on the bicycle. And I hope you will indulge me. I just wanted to throw up this very relevant slide. Because, of course, we are experiencing very difficult times again. So this is a picture of the Women's March on Saturday on Pennsylvania Avenue and these wonderful suffragettes. Now, I'm, of course, not suggesting that we don't have the vote as women, but I think the image speaks for itself. Same shit, different century. And so with this general questioning of traditional setups and hierarchies, we also have, of course, a rise of questioning religious values and religious power structures. We have the Theosophists, the society founded by Helena Blavatsky in New York in 1875, basically an occultist philosophy that was searching for the mysteries of life and nature and how that drove the divine. But we also have these wonderful, I just absolutely love these photographs of these seances where individuals got together to communicate with the dead. And a whole genre of photography came out of that. I show you an example in the middle of these these dead relatives, showing up. Yeah, no manipulation of the photograph going on here at all. And so I think one of the books I put on the syllabus, which is Philip Bloom's The Vertigo Years, really talks quite extensively about this accelerated pace of life, about all of the changes that are going on. And I love the cover for this book because, of course, it's Jacques-Henri Lartique's famous photograph from 1912, where he, as a young man, had been standing at the racetrack for hours trying to capture this fast automobile, and he just gets this blurred image, and he was so disappointed with this photograph. But for us, of course, as historians, it so beautifully encompasses this speed and the blurring of the individual, and so for us it's wonderful. But he, of course, thought he completely blew this photograph that he had set out to take. So all of these exciting but also challenging changes that happened throughout the 19th century really come to a head and accelerate during the 1890s. And the historical actors living through this time period were very much aware of these changes because, and this makes a huge difference to the discussions that we're going to be having, because of the rise of the mass media. So we have discussions in the press, we have the photograph conquering the world. So the mobility of knowledge and people is also further, what's the word I'm looking for? It's furthered by this quick dissemination through the press. So International Art Nouveau comes out of this intense cultural and socio-political activity at the end of the 19th century. And progressive artists, architects, and designers across Europe were keen to tap into this excitement, or at least this sort of sense of change. And they were keen to find a visual language that could embody this energy. So they were consciously turning away from the past, and many of the 19th century revival styles that were so prominent and so popular throughout the 19th century. So these were styles that we as art historians call historicism or historicist styles. So for example, Charles Garnier's Paris Opera, built between 1861 and 1875, is a prime example of a monumental Beaux-Arts building that is basically emulating the Baroque. It's a neo-Baroque building. So that's the kind of visual language, the kind of design and architectural language that the progressive, young, emerging generation of artists, designers, and architects of the 1890s completely rejected. And they wanted to rid themselves of the weight of history. They consciously broke with age-old traditions, and not only age-old traditions, but also the kinds of hierarchies that came with that. So they were very against the academy, for example. They felt that the salon, the official exhibitions, were completely rigged by a jury that supported their own fellow, those who thought like themselves. So the young generation, and I don't necessarily mean young in age, because not every huge Art Nouveau designer was young, but the sort of up-and-coming generation, the progressive, forward-looking generation, they wanted to completely divorce themselves from all of those structures and individuals that were in place. They wanted to be of their own time. They wanted to be modern. And to be modern meant, at this point in time, to turn one's back on the immediate past. Now, just a slight disclaimer, not every international Art Nouveau artist turned his or her back completely on the past. It was the recorded past, the history as it was written in the history books, that they rejected, because international Art Nouveau artists in Scandinavia in particularly were incredibly interested in myth, in folklore, in fairy tales. So Finland, for example, we have the Kalevala, this great mythic poem that was discovered, in quotation marks, in the 19th century. So the progressive thinkers didn't reject the past outright. They were looking for non-recorded history, for that which came before the institutions and the hierarchies. And all of this was really driven by a desire to change European society through the arts. So the arts was given quite a heavy load to bear. The arts was seen as something, art and culture really was seen as something that could overturn some of the problems of European society in the 1890s. And I find that, as a historian, incredibly interesting, because I always think, why am I attracted to certain topics? And of course, we at the moment, especially in the UK, are undergoing a time of deep suspicion of art and culture, where art history was recently threatened to be taken out of English A-levels because it was seen as a soft discipline by our politicians. Luckily, there was such uproar that that decision was reverted. But I think that history always has relevance to our own time, and I think that makes history so interesting, and that's, I think, is so important about thinking very carefully how some of those debates of the 1890s might speak to us today. Sorry, I went a little bit on a tangent here. So this way in which I'm describing international Art Nouveau to you goes a little bit against what some of the 20th century modernists want us to believe. namely that International Art Nouveau was concerned with interiority, inwards turning of individuals, indulgence, both materially and psychologically, and that it was really a style that was deeply seated in the private rather than the public, that it was a style that was characterized by a quest for pleasure and decadence. And don't get me wrong, those concerns were already raised in the late 19th century. Just think of two iconic literary endeavors of individuals exploring this theme of decadence. On the one hand, Joris Karl Huysmans' famous novel Against the Grain, À Rebours, published in 1884, and of course, Oscar Wilde's notorious The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in 1890. And Oscar Wilde's main character, of course, refuses to acknowledge his aging process, and it's instead his portrait that ages. And in Huysmans' À Rebours, we have Jean des Esseintes, who is the main character. He comes at a long line, he's the last in a long line of aristocrats, but he's completely impotent, both socially, economically, and otherwise. So he knows he's the last in his generation. After him, his family will no longer be. So he retreats to his country mansion, and he lives a life of pleasure and decadence. He surrounds himself, again, it's a novel, right? He surrounds himself with prints and paintings by Gustave Moreau, these bejeweled, eccentric and very difficult, sort of hermetically sealed almost paintings. I'm showing you an example with Salome from 1876. And most famously, Des Esseintes, of course, and I'm sure many of you know this famous instance. He has a tortoise, a turtle, that he embellishes with precious and semi-precious stones, and he wants to watch her walk through his decadent home, but he kind of forgets that he weighs her down so much with this decoration that she can't go anywhere. And I'm showing you an illustration for À Rebours by Auguste Leroux from 1920, and there is the famous tortoise right there. So that's one criticism that's regularly leveled against International Art Nouveau. It's this moment where people were just involved in a hedonistic search for pleasure and decadence. And this very criticism didn't start in the 20th century with the modernists. It started right at the time when the Art Nouveau artists were active. Another criticism that's regularly leveled at International Art Nouveau is that it was capital-driven, so it was a commercial style of the bourgeoisie, that it was a style that was exploited by advertisement and is therefore vulgar. And so here I'm showing you just two randomly chosen examples of Art Nouveau or International Art Nouveau advertisements. Now, I'm not denying at all that there were indeed visions and articulations of International Art Nouveau as it manifested itself across a wide geographical and cultural intellectual landscape that were indeed fickle and shallow and commercial. But I would also say that this is the beauty of International Art Nouveau. And this is really what draws me to this style, namely that it was so multifaceted and such a complex phenomenon that really defies its reduction to a singular meaning or a singular moment. So in an endeavor, for example, to embrace the commercial, artists and designers working for these companies also overturned these age-old hierarchies between, for example, the fine arts, paintings exhibited at salons, and commercial graphic art. So I think you can sense that I'm very keen, or quite keen, to keep International Art Nouveau as a term quite open, so that it can accommodate a wide range of artistic visions as they spread across Europe's quite diverse geopolitical context. But I also think that definitions are important. We need to agree on a shared platform of knowledge. We need to speak the same language. And for this reason, I've just come up with this definition of International Art Nouveau as literally being a name given to a style in art, architecture, and design. And this includes, of course, decorative arts, graphic arts, furniture, fashion. So it's that name that we find, to a style that we find in Europe and to a lesser extent in North America from the early 1890s until the First World War. So this is the most basic definition that we're going to be working with. And it's actually a term that emerged in the late 1880s when it was used to describe the work of a group of young Belgian artists, the so-called Les 20, the 20. And it comes, so I'm showing you an example of two of the most famous members of Les 20, Fernand Knopf's painting at the Pinakothek in Munich. It now hangs, called I Locked the Door Up on Myself, which of course famously is an illustration of Christina Rossetti's poem, so Daniel Gabriel Rossetti's sister, or Jan Torop's O Grave, Where is Thy Victory? So when these artists exhibited together, and we'll talk more about them tomorrow when we talk about Brussels, the term that critics used to describe them was actually the term Art Nouveau. But it comes into really wide circulation, of course, in 1900 through the Paris World's Fair. This was really Art Nouveau's metamorphosis from a cocoon to the butterfly, so to speak. And we, of course, use different terms to talk about this style. We talk about Jugendstil in Germany, which looks different from Art Nouveau in France, which in turn looks different from Barcelona's Modernisme. But as I said earlier, all of its makers, collectors, patrons, critics, they were all involved in this project of finding an appropriate visual language to express a modern time. So Art Nouveau was driven by a very self-conscious search for modernity in art and life. So as the physical world was changing, the arts and the use of arts was seen to have to change as well. So what's really important here is that for International Art Nouveau supporters, life and art was intertwined. And that, of course, puts a heavy burden on artists, right? They become the sort of facilitators of this change. It is through their creative spirit that communal life could be regenerated. So it was the architect, the designer, the artist who was seen to have the power to spiritually transform society through the objects that he, and sometimes she, although mostly forgotten, made. And in this context, I wanted to show you the differences: Jugendstil, Art Nouveau, and Modernisme. And this idea is wonderfully encompassed by Henri van de Velde's quote here, where he says, in 1894, "The time has come. The idea of love will be communicated to all men. Art will return to the light in a new form." Remember, modern style for modern age. "The earth has been worked from which the new flower will rise, but we will not see this rise before the complete obliteration of the present," and I would say in brackets, the past. So what's really interesting about this rhetoric, though, this sort of way of speaking about it, is that it doesn't really give very clear instruction as to what this new art should actually look like. And I think this is in part why there was such a great stylistic diversity within international Art Nouveau across Europe. So progressive artists, designers, and architects all responded to this call for the new, but they did so in different ways. And we'll explore these different ways in the next couple of lectures. But I certainly don't want to convey the impression that within international Art Nouveau, anything went, as long as the mandatory requirement that modern objects must look modern was met. So while I'm on the one hand arguing that there was this great stylistic diversity, there were certain important guiding principles that artists, architects, and designers followed. And there were also certain specific sources and inspirations that they drew on. And I will close my lecture this evening by briefly discussing these now in a sort of general sense, but we will return to them more specifically in the course of the next couple of evenings when we look at specific instantiations of this. First of all, supporters of international Art Nouveau across Europe were deeply indebted and influenced by the socially progressive writings and practices of William Morris and the British arts and crafts movement. Now, this is particularly fascinating when we are aware of the historical fact that international Art Nouveau itself had virtually no tracking at all in England and Wales, Scotland being the exception. In England and Wales, critics were very quick to disassociate themselves with this effeminate continental French movement and style. So they didn't want anything to do with it, but the international Art Nouveau artists were deeply, deeply influenced by British art and design philosophies. Unfortunately, I can't go into arts and crafts movement here. We could do a whole summer school on it. But I would say that international Art Nouveau architects and designers were particularly interested in Morris's workshop system and in Morris's revival of craftsmanship, of medieval craftsmanship, of age-old and by the mid-19th century largely forgotten craft practices. So it's the revaluation of craft values in a time of industrial mass production that many of the continental international Art Nouveau artists took from Morris, but also, of course, from John Ruskin's fascinating writings on the relationship between art, society, and labor. They were also incredibly interested, of course, in the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society's events. The Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society was founded in 1888, held regular exhibitions in London, and actually went to international exhibitions like the 1902 Turin exhibition to showcase the designers and architects involved with the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, and Walter Crane famously was its first president. The continental artists and designers were also, as I said, fascinated by Morris's workshop system, where he revived these medieval guild-like setups, and we've talked about that, of course, in relation to Vienna. For those of you who took my Vienna class, the Wiener Werkstätte was very much a similar idea. And I'm showing you here the famous Merton Abbey Mills, which was a textile mill that Morris purchased in 1881 and turned into a printing mill. It had been Huguenot silk weaver's place since the early 18th century, so he didn't completely set it up from scratch. The infrastructure was very much in place. And the continental artists and designers were very much interested in the kind of artistic collaboration that went on between William Morris, Edward Burne-Jones, Rossetti. And I'm here, of course, showing you William Morris and Jane Morris's home, designed by Morris and Philip Webb, Red House in Bexley Heath, just outside southeast London. Completed in 1859, but they only lived there until 1865. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you this wonderful drawing room settle and the murals by Burne-Jones. So this kind of communal living, this artistic collaboration in close proximity. What had less impact was Morris's quite radical socialism. So the desire to make good design available to the masses remained largely unrealized, and International Art Nouveau really was an elitist, if you want to use that judgmental kind of term, style. The second important inspiration that I wanted to briefly mention is, of course, the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, Richard Wagner's synthesis, in his case, opera, of poetry, music, and the visual arts into an ensemble, into an aesthetic whole. And he realized that probably most fully in his Ring of the Nibelung, which he actually worked on between 1848 and 1874. So he worked on the Ring for 26 years. And I'm showing you here a set design of the first Bayreuth Festspielhaus staging of Wagner's Rheingold from the Ring des Nibelungen in 1876. So Wagner advocated this synthesis, and the International Art Nouveau artists very much took that idea, which Wagner wrote about in a famous essay, of course, of 1849 under the title The Total Work of Art, and they advocated a unity of the arts. So overcoming the age-old division between painting and sculpture and the so-called fine arts, and the lesser arts, the minor arts, the decorative arts, in order to achieve this kind of a spiritually uplifting synthesis of the arts across media. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Mackintosh's wonderful Hill House. And what's important about the Wagnerian total work of art, as the International Art Nouveau artists took it on board, is this idea that all these individual design elements only come together when one actually physically is in the space. So it's in the user of the space, it's, to use art history jargon, it's in the beholder that this comes together as an aesthetic whole. And we have, I wanted to read you a wonderful quote about this idea of the overcoming of hierarchies by Émile Gallet, the wonderful glass designer. He said in 1897, quote, "Let us not tire of saying over and over again that there are no castes among the artisans of art, that there are no mean and plebeian arts," unquote. So they were really rejecting the privileging of the fine arts over the decorative, and in the case of International Art Nouveau, the commercial arts, the graphic arts. Another influence, of course, and I deeply regret that I wasn't here last week, because we had a summer school 3-day lecture series on Chaponisme. So for those of you who attended those lectures, you are very well set up. I'm just going to briefly mention it. We have, for the International Art Nouveau artists, they were hugely influenced by the kinds of objects and the kinds of artworks that started to come into the European art market in the second part of the 19th century. As you know, Japan was a closed country since the 1640s. And this self-imposed isolation famously came to an end in 1853 when the American naval squadron under the Commodore Matthew Perry, famously, of course, in Madame Butterfly, arrived and demanded that the country open its ports to foreign powers. So we have the Kanagawa Treaty of 1854, March 1854, and with this opening up, we have a flood of information and goods entering the US and Europe, which then catapults into this craze for all things Japanese, Japonisme. For us in this context, an important player is Siegfried Bing, who I'm showing you here reenacting a Japanese tea ceremony, because he had a gallery when he went to Japan in 1875, and literally there were boatloads of stuff coming back from Japan and then sold on in Europe. So he had a gallery where he specialized in initially Japanese objects. So he's really important in this dissemination of Japanese art and objects. But we, of course, also have the World's Fairs. And so we have a Japanese pavilion, both Chinese and Japanese pavilion, actually, at the 1867 World's Fair. So we have a great interest in all things Japanese. We have, of course, ethnographic expeditions into Japan, and these portfolios of photographs, for example, this whole series of hand-colored photographs coming back, and people are just really fascinated by Japan. The last inspiration and influence that's really important, and this is what I will close with, is what I call, and what other art historians, particularly Greenhalgh, called the cult of nature. So in the late 19th century, there is a real interest in the natural world and in organic form produced by the natural world. And that had a crucial impact for the development of international Art Nouveau's architectural and design language. So in their effort to move away from historicism, from this revival of historical styles, progressive designers, architects embraced instead the sinuous lines and the whiplash forms from botanical studies by individuals such as, for example, the German zoologist Ernst Heinrich Haeckel. And I'm showing you this wonderful photograph of him. He's the individual on the left-hand side in the photograph, getting ready to go on an expedition to the Canary Islands. And Haeckel, again, there's so much to say about Haeckel, but he published this really important book called Kunstformen der Natur, so art forms of nature. And here's an example of the kinds of illustrations that were in this book, and that was, of course, hugely influential it was literally like a portfolio that individuals would consult. And just as an aside, Haeckel was also really important in Germany as a defender and early advocate of Darwin, evolution, and the theory of heredity. He was also really involved in monism, which again, I think epitomizes in such a lovely way the move away from traditional religion and philosophy, because monism basically was a worldview that negated the kind of duality that had so long ruled, the duality of mind and matter, of the world and God. And the monists really believed that there was only one world, that everything was interconnected, and this interconnection really was activated or came through the mind. So there's only one substance, and that is the reality as we perceive it through our minds. But that's just an aside. Another important aspect, of course, of this time period is, again, with the rise of mass media, cheaply available illustrated publications, this knowledge about nature and about evolution became, about botany, about biology, became quickly available to large readerships and audiences. Now, Charles Darwin, of course, is always credited with changing the very contours of the way in which we conceive nature through his theory of heredity and his On the Origins of Species, published in 1859. But there were many, many individuals asking very similar questions. And I just wanted to show you this wonderful sculpture by the German Hugo Reinhold. Again, it is a chimpanzee holding a human skull in his right hand, and like Rodin's thinker, cradling his chin with his left hand. And you can see he's literally sitting on Darwin, right here on Darwin's publication. And here is an open manuscript, and that's really interesting. It's a manuscript with a partial inscription from Genesis at the moment when the serpent was enticing Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge. And the full inscription goes, "And you shall be as God, comma, knowing good and evil." But here the second part, knowing good and evil, was left away. It's only the Latin eritis sictu Deus. Pardon my horrible Latin pronunciation. So on the one hand, the sculpture really embraces evolution, embraces Darwin, but it also cautions us that we mustn't forget about morality in our embrace of scientific knowledge. And in 1851, we already have Edward Forbes, the renowned British naturalist who analyzed the ways in which plant and animal life changed in relation to geological change. He already said that the value to a designer of a scientific comprehension of the world is the insight it gives him into the possible variations of the original and the inexhaustible sources of grace and beauty. So it is the natural world, it is botanical illustrations, all of these expeditions into faraway countries, which don't just happen in the 19th century. I mean, we have expeditions going all the way back to the 16th century, but it is the mass media that makes these kinds of travels so much more exciting and titillating and accessible to such larger audiences. And we have, of course, again, these colonial sections at the World's Fairs, where we don't only show, where the colonialists not only show like the ivory tusks and the material culture of the colonies, but also the plant world. And the last image I wanted to show you is, of course, this interest in importing exotic plants. So the palm house at Kew Gardens, built between 1844 and 48 by the architect Decimus Barton with Richard Turner, an iron founder. So technology, again, enabling this glass and iron structure. And in it, planting, of course, all of these new exotic plants. And that directly impacted international Art Nouveau. So this is the last and wonderful image I want to leave you with this evening. We have Tiffany's famous blue wisteria lamp from approximately 1901. And then René Laligue's quite erotic dragonfly corsage from 1897-98. Erotic and enigmatic, I would say. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we go into our first study of Brussels and Horta, and have a nice evening. Thank you.